The bows tend to be weapons that people just avoid due to them not having that high of DPS, nor really being that fun either. If you compare them to stuff like ranged Ashes of War or even spells, they're gonna pale in comparison as a projectile option, but the bows do have their own uses for them to be a pretty decent secondary weapon. Now the major reason being is that they offer you a projectile attack without having to consume any FP, which, as I always mention, projectile attacks make the game incredibly easy, as you don't have to engage with enemies, nor do you actually have to read enemies' movesets either. For the most part, you can sit at a safe distance and just keep spamming. And with bows, you get access to basically every single damage type and all these different types of status effects, and you're essentially just never going to be able to like run out of arrows either, as you can just have stacks of all these different arrow types and just keep switching back and forth even after you run out of a particular one. Another good thing about the bows is that they tend to be really good as sniping based options, being that you can free aim. You can always like try and aim at the head of certain types of enemies to just do bonus damage, and there are plenty of different types of talismans that you can use to help boost the attacks of bows, especially now as of the DLC. Now there are 3 different types of bows. There are the light bows, medium bows, and great bows. The light bows are obviously the really quick options, don't do as much damage, nor do they go as far, but they're probably going to output some of the highest DPS, as you kind of get some really cool combos like the jumping attack into landing attack. You also get the option of rolling attacks, and they're obviously going to fire a lot faster just on horseback too. Now as for the medium bows, they're a little bit more sluggish, but they obviously do more damage per hit, go a lot further, and if you are using certain types of skills like Rainer arrows, barrage, mighty shot, it's just going to be much better paired alongside a medium bow. And as for the great bows, I consider them to be the best of the 3. Now yes, they tend to be a bit heavier and have higher requirements, but the thing is, you could always just hard swap to a great bow and then just like switch up your arrows as well any single time that you actually want to have like a sniping option. If you're just going through a legacy dungeon and want to pick up enemies at a distance, nothing is going to do it better than the great bows. They can send smaller enemies flying, do amazing damage per hit, and they also get really good weapon skill options. Like the fact that you can put rain of arrows on the great bows is just amazing. This is probably the best skill to put on a bow, as it does just like melt bosses incredibly quickly. Now I think that for the most unfortunate thing about the bows is that 1, they get really bad scalings. So when you're at higher levels, you're definitely going to be noticing a lot of damage fall off, and you wish that some of these bows even at least had like a B scaling, because for the most part they're just all getting D scalings or E scalings. And another thing, a lot of the arrows are just very tedious to try and farm for, and funnily enough, the ones that you farm for are literally just like worse than the ones that you actually buy, because the ones that you can just purchase of like random merchants literally just go further and just sometimes just do more damage too. But if you did want to make a build and actually have access to projectile options, but you don't really care to spec into much mind at all, or if you actually wanted to use a lot of different types of melee skills and you wanted to save your mind for that instead, you could just slap on a bow and actually get yourself a pretty decent projectile. They might not be the most amazing things, but they definitely have their uses. But as for today, we are going to rank all 19 of them from worst to best. And yes, this is going to include every single different type of bow, and it is just based on how well they perform and how useful they are in PvE. Starting off at the bottom, the HARP bow, which is the lowest damaging bow in the entire game. It is a short bow that cannot be infused, but it only gets stuck with the barrage skill, which the barrage skill is perfectly fine. It's decent at proccing status effects, but you could put that on basically every other bow, and barrage with like a medium bow is just going to be way better. Now the only benefit that the HARP bow does have is that it's the lightest bow with the lowest requirements, but the thing is, it's not that much lighter or that much lower of a requirement to warrant its really bad damage. Like I would just put a bit more points into dexterity and use things like the short bow or the composite bow, and that is going to get way more damage. And it's like especially useless because you get it a bit later in the game too. Number 18, the red branch shortbow, which is an infusible shortbow that does scale best off dexterity. Now the thing is, it's just going to be worse than the composite bow in almost every single way. The composite bow does weigh like half a unit more, but you get it right at the beginning of the game and it just gets more damage. Whereas for the red branch bow, you have to farm for it like a bit later into the game, and it's an annoying farm and you just don't get as much damage. Now the composite bow actually gets a 15 strength requirement, where this one is only 8 in strength. But the thing is, to even use a bow, you have to two-hand it, which means that the composite bow only has a 10 strength requirement. And basically every single build in the game is going to have you at least 10 strength anyway. So yeah, there's basically no use for this one. Number 17, the short bow, which is another infusible light bow. This weapon actually does get a quality-based scaling, but it's definitely not a good scaling at all. At higher levels, it performs worse than all the other infusible light bows. And this is yet again just another one that's going to be outclassed by the composite bow. Just put like 2 more points into strength, and you'll just end up gaining a much better weapon. Like the only reason why it's not going to get at the bottom is because you can get it right at the beginning of the game and just gain access to the light bow moveset. Number 16, the Serpent Bow. Now, this weapon is actually a medium bow. I don't really know why it's not a light bow at all, because this thing is incredibly small, and it would benefit greatly, because if the whole purpose of this weapon is to be able to proc a status effect, then weapon would benefit much more if it just had that faster moveset. But yes, this is a medium bow that does get some of the lowest damage in class, and cannot be infused and only gets Mighty Shot as its weapon skill. It does actually get an arcane scaling, but the thing is, it doesn't actually get damage when you put points into arcane. The only benefit you actually have is more status effect build-up. Now, the thing is basically just for poison. I was testing out this weapon with like bleed and even sleep arrows, which typically bleed and sleep work alongside arcane, but it wasn't really even boosting the buildup of those things at all. And with a serpent bow in particular, it actually does give you more poison for every single arrow that you do fire off, but it is only like 15 poison, which does stack on top of like the poison that you get with the arrow, and you can proc poison pretty quickly at a distance. Now, the thing is, it's not deadly poison, it's just regular poison, and regular poison basically sucks. You're gonna get way more damage if you just go with like an actual higher damaging bow and just fire off regular arrows, because poison damage over time is that small to the point where it's just not worth it. Now, it could be pretty decent if you paired it alongside like the poison based buffs, but the thing is with those, you have to be at a close range. So if you are proccing poison at a distance, these buffs are basically useless. And if you did want to proc poison really quickly and actually be at a close range to benefit off the buffs, just use things like Poisonous Mist. It's gonna do it like way faster, not really consume much FP, and do it in an AoE. Number 15, the Horn Bow, which is a split magic damaging medium bow, meaning that no matter what arrow that you do fire with, it's always going to be doing a little bit of magic damage. So being that you're actually doing split damage already, if you're just going to be using the magic based arrows, it's going to be doing the most amount of damage with the Horn Bow, which that's basically its only use. It does actually get a little bit of an intelligence scaling, but it is like a really bad intelligence scaling, so even if you pair it alongside an intelligence build, you're not going to benefit of that much more damage. But if you do pair it alongside all the different types of magic buffs, it could actually end up being one of the highest damaging, if not the highest damaging medium bow in the entire game. I think the only use of this bow is going to be used as like a sniping option if you had like an intelligence based build. But if you do have an intelligence based build, you're going to have access to like sniping based spells anyway. Number 14, EGON'S Greatbow, which is one of the new ones from the DLC. It is one of two infusible greatbows, the other one just being the regular greatbow, and this one actually does get a better strength-based scaling, where the regular greatbow does get a quality scaling, and that one can result in just more damage. At these later levels, if you just have even like the smallest bit of investment into dexterity, it's just going to outdamage the EGON'S Greatbow. And being that you actually get this one later in the DLC, you're probably going to be at that higher level that I'm talking about. And also, if you actually wanted to go with a strength-based greatbow, using something like the Golem's greatbow is just going to do way more damage as well. But that one cannot be infused, so if you actually wanted to use the Rain of Arrows skill, then you could potentially just use the EGON'S greatbow. But the thing is, the Radahn's greatbow also gets like a better version of Rain of Arrows Ash of War, so there really isn't much of a use to the EGON'S greatbow. Number 13, the ERDTREE Greatbow, which is a faith-based bow that actually does get some split holy damage. Now, being that it actually is a split damaging bow, it's just not going to get as much damage as the other ones, unless you are pairing it alongside a faith-based build, specifically using the golden arrows, because other than that specific type of pairing, you're just going to get more damage with all the other different types of bows. And honestly, you're probably just going to get more damage outright if you were just going to use the Golem's Greatbow, because most of the enemies in the game are just resist the holy damage. But if you did have a faith build, it could serve as like a nice sniping-based option. Just pick enemies off at a distance with a bunch of headshots. And with the golden arrow as well, you can actually buff yourself and other allies when you hit them with it, because it actually does have this like golden vow effect. Now the thing is, if you have a faith-based build, you're already going to have access to the golden vow spell, and the golden vow spell is it's going to be better buff than like the golden arrows. So although the buff is nice, it's kind of just better paired with like another different type of bow. I probably would have liked this a lot more if it could be able to get infused, which I don't know why most of these bows just didn't have the ability to just actually change the Ash of War. Like, you can't change the affinities either way, so why not just like switch the Ash of War to something else, especially because it doesn't actually get a unique one. It would have been cool to just pair this alongside Rain of Arrows and just like melt every single death bird in the entire game, because with all these holy buffs and that 20% boost that the golden arrows actually give you, it probably would have been really fun. Number 12, the ERDTREE bow. Now, just as I see the ERDTREE Greatbow is basically just as I see this one as well. It does get that same faith-based scaling with some split holy damage, so actually can result in some of the highest damage out of all the bows in their particular class, but it's just going to be with those holy types of builds. And being that holy damage is pretty poor in the base game, it'll probably still not end up getting as much damage as some of the other options. But when you do pair it alongside the golden arrows, you are going to get a nice little damage boost, and going into the faith status is going to further enhance the damage, because the holy damage of the arrow is just going to scale off faith too. So I think the major use of these bows is to like go through dungeons and catacombs and fight off a bunch of these skeletons and not really have to lose any FP, which is pretty nice. But the thing is, there's like plenty of different like holy based spells in the game that can do the exact same thing for not much FP. But yeah, once again, I just wish that these things could be able to get infused, because the ERDTREE bow just gets stuck with Mighty Shot, and I'd just much rather put Rain of Arrows on this thing so I could just melt all these like larger different types of bosses that are weaker to holy damage, and it probably would have been really cool. Number 11, the Misbegotten Shortbow, which is another infusible light bow. This one actually does get the most damage in class. It does scale best of strength, which typically I'm just gonna like the dexterity bows better, because it is gonna have better synergy in my opinion. Because if you have a strength build, you're gonna have access to other different types of projectile options. But the main reason why I'm still going to put the Misbegotten Shortbow in the C tier, despite it getting the highest damage in class, is because it gets the worst range. And with bows, you get really bad damage fall off. So the range stat is like one of the most important things. Like, you don't have to be that far away from a boss to really notice the damage fall off. And in those instances to where like you're a little bit further away from a boss, all the other short bows, especially the composite bow, are just going to do more damage. Like, it's still going to be a perfectly fine option. You can get it early game, although you don't have to farm for it, and it's going to get nice damage still. But I would just much rather go with some of the other light bows. Number 10, the ALBINAURIC bow, which is one of two infusible medium bows, the other one being the longbow, and this one actually does get the higher damage. Now the thing is, the infusible medium bows aren't going to get as much damage as the other different types of bows, but just having the ability to switch back and forth between different types of skills, like Rain of Arrows and Mighty Shot, they're going to be very valuable in my opinion. Now the reason why I'm going to value the longbow a little bit more, despite it being just like directly outclassed in terms of damage, is because a longbow is just much easier to acquire. You get it right at the beginning of the game, you don't have to farm for anything, and it doesn't even get that much less damage than the ALBINAURIC bow to warrant having to farm for it all the way in the consecrated snowfield off those stupid ALBINAURIC archers. Like, it's a really annoying farm to the point where I wouldn't really bother with it. Now if you did want to go through the effort, it is just going to be the direct upgrade and be the best infusible medium bow. But at number 9, the longbow, which as I mentioned is another infusible medium bow. You can get it right at the beginning of the game. Now as I mentioned, I do like medium bows the worst compared to things like light bows and great bows, because in 1v1 fights I would rather just have the light bow moveset, as it can just result in higher DPS and faster status effect build up. But the medium bows will actually get you more damage with things like Mighty Shot and Rain of Arrows. But if you actually were going to use bows for that reason, whether it be against larger bosses or as a sniping option, the great bows just have that beat, because great bows can also actually equip Rain of Arrows to melt larger bosses, but they also do have their own different types of sniping weapon skills that it just makes them the much better option, because they just go way further and just do more damage. Now obviously great bows are going to have higher requirements and weigh a whole bunch more, so I think that's where the medium bows do come into play. It's like a nice little medium, like if you don't really want to have to spec into that much stats just to wield the other bows, it could be pretty good, but I think that's its only use, is like it's just for convenience. Number 8, the black bow, which this is a medium bow that does get the lowest damage in class, but the thing is, it actually shares some of the same moveset as the light bow, and it's almost to the point that the existence of the black bow kind of just makes a lot of the other light bows just useless, because the best parts of those weapons is that you can get these cool jumping attack into landing attack combos, and you can just attack really quickly this way, also benefit off rolling attacks, and it just feels really fluid and fun. So this weapon is basically giving you the light bow moveset, but with medium bow damage and medium bow range. So if you actually were to get in these 1v1 fights to where I consider the light bows to be best, the black bow is just going to be better than all of them. Now the reasons why I'm still going to put it a bit lower on the list is because 1, you can't infuse it and it just gets stuck with barrage as a skill, and I would just much rather just have Rain of Arrows, because just having the utility to be able to like melt larger bosses with a bow is just much more useful in my opinion. And it's to the point that I would just rather have like a good damaging light bow with Rain of Arrows compared to just having the black bow in itself. Because the thing is, like, bows get shit scalings anyway, so even at these really high levels, it's not going to get that much more damage than a light bow. And another reason why I'm still going to put this thing into the B tier is because as of the DLC releasing, we have the ANSBAC'S longbow, which is another medium bow that gets the exact same moveset, and this weapon just gets more damage and just has the much better skill as well. Number 7, the Bone Bow, which is one of the other ones from the DLC. This one actually is going to get some of the lowest damage compared to all the bows, which it is a light bow, so it is going to have the faster moveset, which is really nice, but it's not going to get as much damage as the composite bow. But this weapon actually does get a unique skill in Rancor Shot, which is just like a reskinned version of Barrage, as it does fire at these arrows in really quick succession, this one consuming 3 FP per attack compared to the Barrage only consuming 2. But the thing is, with Rancor Shot, it just does more damage, and it goes like ridiculously far due to its insane tracking. Like, this skill is like incredibly easy to use. Like, even if you're fighting enemies that like to move and dodge around so many times, it's gonna hit them pretty consistently while doing some decent damage. Now I would like to put it higher, but unfortunately they like nerfed the status effect effect build-up for this thing for some reason. Like, there was one of the patches after the DLC released to where in PvE, the status build-up with this skill is just so much worse to the point where it's like almost impossible to proc bleed. Like, it'll take like 60 arrows just to be able to proc bleed even against like the most basic of bosses. And with a skill like this, you'd think it actually would just proc status effects quickly. But no, you can literally proc status effects quicker with just using the regular bow attacks. Number 6, the pulley bow, which is the highest damaging medium bow in the game, and actually does get boosted range as well. And it's to the point that it can get like just as much range, if not more range, than things like greatbows. Now, unfortunately, the pulley bow does just get stuck with mighty shot, which is just going to be a sniping based skill. So the only purpose of the weapon is it's going to be used as a sniper. And if you wanted to use a sniping bow, the greatbows once again are just going to outclass that. But the pulley bow does weigh a lot less and have really low requirements, only 11 in strength and dexterity. You can basically pair this alongside any different type of build, and this actually gets you a nice sniping option. If you didn't have that much endurance for equipment load, nor have that high of strength or dexterity to wield the greatbows, I would just go with the pulley bow. Number 5, the composite bow. Now, if you actually wanted to go with a primary bow-based build, I think this one is actually the best one to use just for the base game. Now, as I've been mentioning, with bows, they're typically going to be better as secondary options because they might be good at sniping, kiting enemies in, or even just like melting larger bosses from a distance. But the light bow moveset actually makes it to where these weapons are really good in basically any single circumstance. Against like really quick enemies in this like 1v1 fight, the composite bow can actually be really fun and easy to use. If you just keep spamming that jumping attack into the landing attack combo, and just try to stand at a safer distance, it can be extremely powerful. And with the fact that it can be infused, you can actually slap on rain of arrows with this thing, and it could be a good way to just melt larger bosses too. So yeah, it's just an easy bow to use that you get right at the beginning of the game that's really light with low requirements. Number 4, the regular greatbow, which is one of 2 infusible greatbows. This one actually is going to do the higher amount of damage, but only if you do go spec into a little bit of dexterity, as the weapon does get somewhat of a quality-based scaling, which actually is pretty decent because typically with these quality-based builds, you would lack projectile types of options as there is no like seal or staff available to you, but you do have this greatbow, and with its ability to be infused, you're going to have a good sniping option due to things like through and through and Egon's Great Hunt, and you're going to have an option to like melt bosses really quickly with rain of arrows. Like, greatbows are just like severely underrated, and this one is going to be one of the more useful ones. It's just good in so many different types of scenarios, and if you haven't used it before, I recommend that you do. Now, the only reason why it's not going to get a bit higher is because if you did want to go with that raining arrows build, the lion greatbow is just going to do it better. And if you wanted a sniping option, at earlier levels, the golem's greatbow is just going to get more damage anyway. But once you get a bit later on, especially in New Game Plus, and equip things like Egon's Great Hunt, the greatbow might be the better sniping option. Number 3, the Golem Greatbow, which is the highest damaging bow in terms of AR. And if you actually wanted to go with like a good sniping option in the base game, I would just recommend going with the Greatbow. And probably like in later game in New Game Plus, I would rather just go with the normal Greatbow instead. And the reason for that is because this weapon does get stuck with the skill through and through, which is a decent skill. It's high damaging. When you pair it alongside the Golem arrows, it actually can go through enemies and hit them multiple times, specifically against larger bosses. Now, the thing is, if you were to fight larger bosses, I would just rather use Rain of Arrows or the Lion's Greatbow. And the Lion's Greatbow can actually get more damage too, because it gets bonus damage with the Radahn Spears. So I just consider that one to just be the upgrade if you were going to try and fight bosses. But obviously the Lion's Greatbow doesn't actually get like a sniping based skill like the Golem's Greatbow does. But as of the DLC releasing, we do have the Egon's Drake Hunt skill. And this skill is just a better sniping option. The skill actually doesn't go through enemies like Through and Through does, but it does just do more damage per hit. And it's to the point that if you had like a Greatbow at higher levels and put on the Egon's Drake Hunt skill, it would just do more damage than the Golem's Greatbow with Through and Through, but it still is deserving of being in the top 3 because it does get some of the highest damage. You can get it very early on. It does only get upgraded with the Somber Stones, and it can just hit really hard. Number 2, the Lion Greatbow, which I consider this one to be the best Greatbow in the game. As I mentioned with the Golem's Bow, it's not going to get as high as AR as that one, but when you put on the Radahn Spears, it actually does get 20% damage boost. And in that instance, it can just outdamage the Golem Bow, especially if you actually end up getting a second Lion Bow and put it in your back and just stack the passive effects. But even then, the best part about the weapon is going to be its skill, which is just a reskinned version of Rain of Arrows. But the difference being is that it literally just like fires off more arrows, so it can just do more damage. It'll end up firing like roughly 50% more arrows and just melt bosses a lot faster, especially if you do pair it alongside the Radahn Spears. Now, the trade-off being is that it does consume like 12 more FP. So if you actually were going to go with a quality build with like lower amounts of mind, you're probably better off just going with like a regular Greatbow and using the Rain of Arrows skill. And another downside is that the Radahn Spears tend to be pretty expensive. So it's probably the best Greatbow, but it's definitely not perfect. And that's number 1, the ANSBACH'S longbow, which is a medium bow that does actually get some of the lowest damage in class, but it does actually share the exact same moveset as the light bow. So that means you get the really cool jumping attack into landing attack combo, you get the good rolling attacks. So you essentially just get this really fast moveset while just getting the damage and range of a medium bow, which obviously is just insane and kind of makes almost every single light bow just obsolete. But even then, the best part about the weapon is going to be its skill, fan shot. For only 11 FP, it fires off 8 arrows at once, and obviously with firing all these different arrows, you're doing so much damage in an instant. Like typically when you're using bows, it always feels like you're just lacking a whole bunch of damage, and it tends to be pretty boring because you're just like picking away at an enemy's health at a further distance, which can be very viable. But sometimes you just want to hit really hard, and that's where the ANSBACH'S longbow comes into play. Like the existence of this weapon kind of makes pure bow builds very viable, especially now with all these different types of talismans that we have to boost the damage. Like you can just throw in the sharp shot talisman, just free aim with the skill, and just get ridiculous damage. It's going to be good at hitting multiple enemies at once. Enemies like to move around. It's going to stagger really well. It's good with large bosses, small bosses, and the status effect buildup is going to be just as much if you're at point blank range compared to if you're at like a really far distance. Like it doesn't really matter how many arrows that you hit with the skill. It's always going to do that same amount, which is like typically twice as much as like a regular bow shot. Now, the only reason why I'm not going to put it into the S tier is because it's a bow. So it's going to get really bad scalings. And typically when you get later in the game and in New Game Plus, you're going to experience a little bit of damage fall off. And it's going to be especially annoying because this thing consumes 8 arrows per attack. So you'll be draining through your ammunition really quickly with this skill for some bosses. But it doesn't change the fact that it's still going to be the best bow in the game. Okay, that's now done. I spent way too much time talking about these mediocre ass weapons that From Software did not put too much effort into making. Maybe in the next game, if they bring back bows, they'll make them a lot more interesting and unique. Like they did take a step in the right direction with the DLC types of bows, but it still could be a lot better in my opinion. Now, as for the next video, I'm not sure if I actually do go to the DLC categories or rank things like the seals or the staffs. Just let me know what you want down in the comments below. And